Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, liebe Studierende an der Universität Erfurt zur Ringvorlesung zum Thema Judentum und Bildung. Wir haben heute die große Freude, Judith Frischmann bei uns zu haben, die sich aus Amsterdam zugeschaltet hat und einen Vortrag mit dem, ich würde sagen, recht provokanten Titel Is Education Good for Jewish Girls? Halten wird. Frau Professor Dr. Frischmann ist emeritierte Professorin für Jewish Studies an der Leiden University und hat am Center for the Study of Religion gearbeitet. Sie war und ist außerdem Beiratsmitglied im Research Center Jüdische Rituale an der Universität Erfurt und hat uns die letzten 5 Jahre dort sehr fachkräftig und mit großem Wissen begleitet. Für ihren Vortrag sollen Sie wissen, dass Frau Frischmann an der Yeshiva High School in New York City Talmud studiert hat und 1987 eine Kuratorin war für eine Ausstellung in Amsterdam zur sich verändernden Rolle der Frauen im Judentum. Das wird beides im Vortrag eine Rolle spielen. Ihre gegenwärtigen Projekte beschäftigen sich mit Samuel Hirsch und sie strebt ein neues Projekt an, zusammen mit Kollegen aus Cambridge, das Juden und Muslime in der Moderne vergleichen wird. Also trotz Emeritierung ist Judith Frischmann immer noch dabei, zu forschen und weiterzuarbeiten, zu publizieren. Nach der Vorlesung, nach dem Vortrag werden Sie wieder die Möglichkeit haben, Fragen zu stellen. Bitte richten Sie diese vielleicht auch schon während des Vortrages an Professor Benedikt Kranemann unter der Adresse benedikt.kranemann@uni-erfurt.de. Entschuldigung, benedikt.kranemann@uni-erfurt.de. Frau Frischmann, wir freuen uns auf Ihren Vortrag. Is Education Good for Jewish Girls?
So, good evening, everyone. I will begin my talk this evening with an excerpt from Ilana Kurashan's book, If All the Seas Are Ink, a memoir, a book she wrote in 2017 after trying to recover from her divorce. Could we have, yeah, thank you. My commitment to studying Talmud began nearly a decade ago on another early morning when my friend Andrea and I were running hills, the only kind of running one can do in Jerusalem. The air was cool and crisp, but we were already sweating in the knee-length shorts we wore in deference to the city's unwritten modesty code. As we huffed and puffed up the steep hill to the Knesset, I turned to Andrea and joked, "We will ascend Jerusalem at the height of our joy," a paraphrase of a biblical verse recited at traditional Jewish weddings. I thought briefly about how I'd recited those words at my own wedding 1 year earlier. A moment I winced to recollect, but my quotation made Andrea think of the text and not its marital context, or so it seemed, because she turned back to look at me, a few paces behind, and casually remarked, "Did I tell you? I've started learning a page of Talmud a day." My jaw dropped. "What did you say?" I pushed myself to keep up because I wanted to hear more. The Andrea I knew enjoyed hanging out in bars, reading paperback thrillers, and staying in shape. It was hard to imagine why she'd be interested in the Talmud, a vast compendium of Jewish law and narrative dating back to the first centuries of the Common Era. The Talmud is famous for its nonlinear argumentation, sprawling discussions, and complex analysis of the finer points of Jewish religious law, a far cry from the latest Stephen King. What business did Andrea have with the Talmud? "It's called Daf Yomi," she told me, and I recognized the phrase Hebrew for daily page. though it's more accurately translated as daily folio, since every page of Talmud consists of 2 sides, back and front, with no square inch lying fallow. Each page brims with printed Hebrew letters, leaving only the narrowest margins. Just recently, there had been a widely publicized Daf Yomi celebration in Madison Square Garden, with thousands of Jews gathering to mark the completion of their study of the Talmud. They were mostly men in black suits and white shirts, with corkscrew curls hanging down over their ears. Anyone can do it, Andrea added, as if reading my thoughts. You go through a page of Talmud a day, and you finish in 7.5 years. How cool is that? In 7.5 years, you've read what is arguably the most important book of Jewish law. But why, I asked her, why do you care so much about Jewish law? I mean, you don't keep Shabbat, you've dated non-Jewish guys. Why do you want all these rabbis peering over your shoulder? Because they're not just talking about legal stuff. They're arguing with their wives, insulting their students, one-upping their colleagues. And when talking about law, they're not telling you what to do. They're figuring it all out, invoking not just the Bible, but also folk tales, fables, and cultural myths. On yesterday's page, I read about the 3 entrances to hell, one of which was in Jerusalem. Andrea smiled at me from beneath the brim of her baseball cap. I guess, I said, wondering where exactly that gateway to hell was located as we wove through the streets of the ancient city. But what do you hope to get out of it? I asked. All the Talmud, I mean. I don't know, Andrea said and shrugged, rivulets of sweat trickling down her shoulders. I think it's partially the thrill of the challenge. You know, like running a marathon. It's fun to set impossible goals and then slowly make them more possible. I thought of the story of the great 2nd century Rabbi Akiva chipping away at a mountain stone by stone, gradually uprooting it and casting it into the River Jordan. It is a metaphor for how this sage, who began learning relatively late in life, came to master the whole Torah. But that was Rabbi Akiva. We finished running by 7 a.m. and parted ways. I couldn't stop thinking about what Andrea had told me. What would it be like to take on a 7.5-year project? It was almost impossible to imagine my life in 7.5 years. At the time, I could barely get through the days, let alone commit to getting through the entire Babylonian Talmud, a text divided into 6 orders, 37 tractates or volumes, and some 2,700 pages. But then I thought about how moving on is about putting one foot in front of the other or turning page after page. If every day I turned a page, then eventually a new chapter would have to begin. One chapter would lead to another, and then another, and before long, I'd have completed an entire tractate. What a healthy relationship to time, viewing it not as a mark of age, but as an opportunity to grow in wisdom. If I learned a page a day, then instead of resigning myself to being one day older, I could aspire to be one day wiser. Can I have the next slide, please? A page of the Babylonian Talmud. You see it's full, and then the next. And the next. Yes, thank you. So my talk this evening is going to be divided into these three sections, and I'm going to start with the importance of Torah and the rules regarding its study. Jewish women studying Torah and Talmud. Secular Jewish women studying Talmud. What's so unusual about that? Well, just about everything. Let me start from the beginning, from the period of Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism to which most Jews today are heirs. The term Torah refers to both the written and the oral tradition, which includes the Talmud, and its study, according to the rabbis, is one of the most important commandments. And the study of Torah, they say, is equivalent to them all, to all commandments. The one who does so becomes a partner in bringing the divine presence among the people of Israel. Torah study is considered the most important heritage of the Jewish people, and as such, it needs to be passed down from generation to generation. This cultural heritage, like any other important cultural heritage in antiquity, was and has been the prerogative of men. According to an early 3rd century source, it is the father's obligation to teach his son, and not the mother's. A man's duty to study himself, and not women's comparable duty. And a man's duty to teach his sons, and not his daughters. According to the rabbis, women are obligated to know the halachot, the legal rulings, that they are mandated to observe. These are limited to the negative commandments or prohibitions, you shall not, and the positive commandments that are not bound to time. Women are exempted from time-bound positive commandments, you shall do. But you may object, Torah study is not time-bound, is it? However, the Talmud understands the verse coming from the first paragraph of the Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, which is recited several times daily, Vishinamtam livanecha, and you shall teach them to your sons. Livanecha can mean children. The rabbis interpret it to mean sons. Sons, but not daughters, are obligated to study Torah. This exemption is twofold. Firstly, women are exempted from studying those parts of the Torah that they need not observe. Secondly, they are exempt from a thorough and intensive study of Torah altogether. They only need to study what is necessary for them to ensure proper fulfillment of the commandments. And this they learn from a minimal amount of text and basically from their mothers and their grandmothers. But note that this text does not expressly forbid women to study. However, Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah in Sotah, these are the rules concerning an adulterous woman, did prohibit teaching women Torah. He said, anyone who teaches his daughter Torah, it is as if he is teaching her tiflut. What is tiflut? The 11th century French Talmudic scholar Rashi and the 12th century philosopher Maimonides disagree on the meaning of the word tiflut. According to Rashi, tiflut means immorality. Women with improper spiritual motives would study the Torah and might use its knowledge to undermine and violate its precepts. In other words, if you gain wisdom, you also gain shrewdness, and women would use their shrewdness in a wicked way. The Rambam, Maimonides, understood tiflut to mean triviality. A woman who studies Torah, he says, will be recompensed, but not in the same measure as a man. For study was not imposed on her as a duty. And one who performs a meritorious act, a mitzvah, that is not obligatory, will not receive the same reward as one upon whom it is incumbent, who is obligated, and who fulfills it as a duty, but only a lesser reward. And notwithstanding that she is recompensed, that she will receive some reward, yet the sages have warned us that the man shall not teach his daughter Torah, as the majority of women have not a mind adequate for its study, but because of their limitations, will turn the words of Torah into trivialities. The sages said, he who teaches his daughter Torah, it is as if he taught her tiflut. This stricture refers only to instruction in the oral law. With regard to the written law, he ought not to teach it to her, but if he has done so, it is not regarded as teaching her tiflut. And once more, the written Torah, these are the books of the Bible. Throughout the Middle Ages, rabbinic authorities maintained Rabbi Eliezer's dictum that a man should not teach his daughter Torah. However, they did make some exceptions, allowing either some women who were special, especially gifted to study Torah, or to allow women to study certain texts, particularly from the written Torah. Yet, although women were generally thought to have understanding, they were said to lack the intellectual and analytical capacity to study theoretical matters. And of course, the Talmud is full of discussions of theoretical matters. Things were to take a turn with the Enlightenment and the onset of modernity. In her book, Gender and Assimilation in Modern Jewish History, The Roles and Representation of Women, Professor Paula Hyman, who unfortunately died an untimely death, denotes the changes as the paradoxes of assimilation, the changes that took place in modernity. In what follows, I will explain what she means. We can roughly discern two different patterns of assimilation arising in modernity, both of them gendered. The one pattern is typical of Western and Central Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. The other is typical of Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, the dominant cultural model is that of the middle class. Communal leaders in the West propagated gender roles reflecting the bourgeois ideal, men in the public sphere and women in the domestic sphere. Men became responsible for the secular business of running society, and women responsible for the inculcation of moral and religious values. While hoping for civic equality and access to the cultural wealth of Western civilizations, Jews in the 19th century presumed that entry into the larger society would be accompanied by the survival of Jews in Judaism. The burden of setting limits to assimilation was placed on women. While they stayed at home, particularly prior to marriage, women acquired all sorts of language and musical skills and were familiarized with the surrounding culture. And they were also, by the way, considered a financial burden on their parents, and their parents, their father especially, was eager to get them married off. Here in this slide, you see a painting by Moritz Daniel Oppenheim, the Freitagabend, the father blessing his girls after the lighting of the candles. The Sabbath candle lamp is hanging in the middle of the room, and we see the father standing to the right, the mother sitting at the left, suckling her baby, and the whole family is dressed in modern bourgeois style. Perhaps the person on the right might be the grandfather. He is dressed in more traditional dress. In the course of the 20th century, or even earlier, girls were encouraged to attend secular schools, and aside from language, were introduced to the fields of literature, history, philosophy, and more. Jewish men criticized women's engagement with society at large. However, the women did not have the Jewish education necessary to fulfill the task of guaranteeing Jewish survival. Can I have the next slide, please? Here we see a quote from the Archiv Israelit, where the writer is saying, complaining about women who should be staying at home and taking care of the children and bringing the religious values to them. The opportunities for acquiring Jewish education now expanded, as did the chance to explore the meaning of their Jewishness and for carrying their domestic responsibilities into the public domain. For example, women became involved in social welfare. And this was also, of course, later in the early 19th century, very much influenced, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, influenced by the first feminist wave. While Jewish men sought to acculturate women, they were still perceived by the outside world as being different, as other. passing on Jewish culture was no longer a symbol of Jewish manhood. Therefore, the men sought to distance themselves from the women, who now became the true representation of Jewishness and were confronted with negative representations of themselves. For example, the Jewish mother and the Jewish princess, and I have a 20th century example in this slide. Most of you will know Philip Roth and Portnoy's complaint, and his complaint, of course, is about his Jewish mother. Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the process and pace of acculturation differed from that in the West, certainly until the interbellum, the period between the two world wars. Jews usually lived in structured societies that limited assimilation and social integration. The presence of those who were more secularized was not perceived as a threat to Jewish survival. Internal ethnic identity was strong, and it was reinforced by the outside world. Economic security was top priority, as was solving the Jewish problem. However, the solution to the Jewish problem was not sought in assimilation, as it was in the West, but rather in forms of Jewish nationalism, right? Not meaning per se Zionism. Zionism was one form of it. We know that in Eastern Europe, there were all sorts of nations identified, and the Jews thought they could be one of those within Eastern Europe. Also, socialism and the socialist revolution, and emigration. Women were basically excluded from the domain of public society, under whose aegis these movements fell. So women were encouraged to participate in socialism and in Zionism, but when they did, they really were treated as, well, the maids and the cooks, and they weren't really given leadership roles. In the East, where most boys, can I have the one with the boys on it, please? In the East, where most boys still attended the Cheder, the role of passing on Jewish culture, as opposed to the West, was not relegated to women. We can have the next slide. Women entered the workforce alongside their husbands, a phenomenon dictated by the economic reality. And traditionally, Jewish society legitimated female support of the Torah scholar's family. While their men studied, the women ran the business, or at least took an active part in the family stores, in trade, and much more. Women, even among the more traditionalists, continued to speak Yiddish and served as models of religious piety, were committed to traditional culture, but were still involved in commerce. For other women, these work patterns granted them access to secular education, where they, and not the men, took the lead in the process of secularization and adapting to the culture of their social class. They felt excluded from Torah study, which was still valued in the world in which they lived, and they were eager for education, even acquiring Jewish learning from their fathers, by way of exception. Other women, particularly unmarried women, converted. So the greatest number of conversions took place among women, as opposed to the West, where it was the men who at least mixed married. In the East, it was the women who, particularly unmarried women, who converted. For the majority of women, it was only upon emigration to America that the gendered roles began to change. So we can have the next slide. Sorry, okay. So in summary, when we look at the paradoxes of Jewish assimilation, we see that in the West, the goal for Jewish men is success in the marketplace. The Torah scholar no longer represents Jewish manhood. As men become more acculturated and estranged from Jewish culture, women who have been relegated to the home are now held responsible for passing on Jewish culture and guaranteeing Jewish survival. They seek, demand, and initiate Jewish education. Some even desire to take on new roles, such as the rabbinate, as did Regina Jonas, who in 1935 became the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi. And you've heard about her from Rabbi Klapek. And here's a picture of Regina Jonas. And she said the following: "If I confess what motivated me, a woman, to become a rabbi, two things come to mind: my belief in God's calling and my love of humans. God planted in our hearts skills and a vocation without asking about gender. Therefore, it is the duty of men and women alike to work and create according to the skills given by God." In the East, the possibility to acculturate is limited, and men still occupy traditional roles in Jewish society. Women join the workforce and, having been barred from Torah education, strive for secular education. They are the first to acculturate. Some even leave the fold. Others, in reaction to this acculturation, call for Jewish education for girls. One of the most famous among them is Sarah Schneer. She is the founder of the Beis Yaakov School for Girls, a school that taught only girls, Orthodox girls, Jewish education, including Torah study. And her chain of schools grew to be a worldwide phenomenon, with thousands of women attending schools everywhere. Could we just have the picture of the school of the girls? I think it's in the next slide. Yeah, here we see a picture of the students of the Krakow Beis Yaakov on an outing in the spa town of Rabka, not so far outside of Krakow. Okay, thank you. Can we go back to the text of Sarah Schneider? Right. "As we pass through the days before the high holidays, fathers and sons travel, and thus they are drawn to Ger, to Belz, to Alexander, to Bovov, to all those places that had been made citadels of conceited religious life, dominated by the figure of the Rebbe's personality." These were, by the way, towns where the Hasidim were living. "And we stay at home, the wives, the daughters, and the little ones. We have an empty festival. It is bare of Jewish intellectual content. The women have never learned anything about the spiritual meaning that is concentrated within a Jewish festival. The mother goes to the synagogue, but the services echo faintly into the fenced and boarded off women's galleries. There is much crying by elderly women. The young girls look at them as though they belong to a different century. Outside the synagogues, the young girls stay chattering. They walk away from the synagogue where their mothers pour out their vague and heavy feelings. They leave behind them the wailing of the older generation and follow the urge for freedom and self-expression. Further and further from the synagogue they go, further away to the dancing, tempting light of a fleeting joy." The question regarding the desirability of modernity and the degree to which it is possible to be both modern or postmodern and Jewish at the same time has been expressed most pressingly from the 1950s onward by the issue of women's equality. Some authorities, like their 19th century predecessors, have condemned women's demanding change as egoists who would sacrifice the Jewish family, the cornerstone of Judaism, and the unity of the Jewish people for their own personal advancement. Others welcome women's fuller participation in public life as a key to Jewish survival. Propelled by the second feminist wave, Jewish women worldwide have identified inequities in Jewish law, sought new images to reflect their multifaceted lives and provide them with meaningful role models. Established consciousness-raising groups, appointed Talmud teachers for girls, become recognized scholars of the Bible, rabbinics, and Jewish history, and been appointed to key positions in Jewish theological seminaries. Ancient ceremonies have been reinterpreted and new rituals relating to the female life cycle have been created. The forming of women's prayer groups has served as an alternative for those excluded from active participation in all parts of synagogue service. These all-female groups have often been the most innovative in the areas of liturgy, reintroducing Tichinot, the personal prayers composed by East European women in Yiddish, and composing their own prayers and prayer books. The ordination of women as rabbis has proven most controversial. The Reform movement in the United States ordained Sally Priesand as its first female rabbi in 1976. The conservative movement followed in 1985 with the ordination of Amy Eilberg. Rabbi Alon Tolwin, director of Aish in Detroit. Aish is quite an Orthodox movement with outreach to Jews everywhere. And he wrote in reaction to Sarah Horowitz's being conferred the title of Rabbah in the Orthodox community in 2010, he wrote as follows: simply put, as there cannot be a kosher clam, there cannot be a female rabbi. This is not because there is something wrong or lacking in womanhood or rabbihood. The two are simply not compatible. The modern Orthodox movement, while opposing ordination, no longer looks suspiciously at women desiring to enter the rabbinate in 2021. The rabbinic leadership notes that more than ever before, Orthodox Jewish women are learning Torah and have reached unprecedented levels of scholarship and professional achievement. And they also note that women have taken on leadership roles, often close to them in the past. These women are acknowledged to be motivated by Yirat Shamayim and Ahavat Hashem, the awe of heaven and love of God. And this is a change because formerly they were seen as just being heretical, trying to introduce modern ideas into Judaism. Nevertheless, and here it comes, and I quote, "The American culture of personal autonomy and the egalitarian ethos inexorably clashes with the Torah value of placing normative halachic conduct above individual choice and halachic dictates above individual freedom." These are the words of the rabbis in their letter disapproving on behalf of the Orthodox Union in the United States against women's ordination. They do note, however, that women should be encouraged to play communal roles, such as teaching ongoing classes and shiurim, so that means studying of Torah, and delivering lectures, serving as visiting scholars in residence, serving in senior managerial and administrative positions, and taking on new roles, such as serving as a synagogue staff member to supplement synagogue rabbis in educational opportunities, or serving as a staff member in the role of professional counselor, or serving as a teacher and mentor to guide females through the conversion process. The position of Yoetzet Halacha, that means an advisor of Halacha, which women have been doing, especially on matters of ritual purity, the rabbis see as more questionable because it balances between a mere advisory role and that of a halachic expert. And so they are impinging on the role consigned to rabbis or the clergy. Ironically, whereas the modern Orthodox world has refused the title of clergy for women, the ultra-Orthodox community, while declaring women's ordination a radical and dangerous departure from Jewish tradition and the Misoras HaTorah, has already adopted the term clergy for their own women spiritual figures. Meanwhile, anno 2021, Sarah Horowitz's Yeshivat Maharat, whose mission it is to educate, ordain, and invest in passionate, committed Orthodox women who model a dynamic Judaism to inspire and support individuals and communities, is now entering its 12th year and has graduated 43 women. Despite protests to the contrary, women rabbis are now serving in an array of modern Orthodox synagogues. the refusal of the modern Orthodox community to grant women the title of rabbi clearly has to do with the Rabbinical Council of America and the Orthodox Union's sense of loss of authority, a loss that they consciously and purposefully associate with accommodation to the secular world. At the same time, the Orthodox Union does acknowledge the need to strive for greater equality between men and women who occupy non-rabbinic leadership positions, and the need to pay substantial attention to women's needs and agendas. At this very moment, the past half year, a revelation has taken place within the ultra-Orthodox world in Israel. This past June, women were admitted to take the chief rabbi's examinations in halakha. They will not be able to serve as rabbis or as rabbinical court judges. However, the civil service will treat the women's exam in the same fashion as it treats the men's rabbinical exams. This means the women will be entitled to certain benefits to which others with a bachelor degree are entitled, because in Israel, rabbinic ordination is considered the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. Israel's chief rabbinate rejected the decision, saying that it is not an institute for higher education and that its role is to train rabbis in Israel. It added that Sephardic chief Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef instructed rabbinate professionals to wholly oppose rabbinate training of women. The Jewish law, he says, and tradition that the rabbinate must maintain does not allow for the training of women in the rabbinate. Elad Kaplan, the attorney representing the women who wanted to take the exam and were allowed to take the exam, said the following: "One would have expected the rabbinate to magnify and glorify Torah study by opening its gates to female Torah scholars, without it being necessary to set up a new agency for this." And he added, the rabbinate's inability to accept the gender changes taking place in religious society is liable to erode its foundations. Within the non-Orthodox movements, the road to equality has been long, but has progressed steadily with the ever-increasing number of female graduates. Perhaps we could have the next slide. Here we have, you can see the man on the right and the woman next to him were the lawyers who defended the women who wanted to take the exam, the chief rabbi's exam, the two women who are on the left. So within non-Orthodox movements, the road to equality has been long but progressed steadily with the ever-increasing number of female graduates. Moreover, studies indicate that a gender transformation has taken place in these movements so that Jewish American women surpass Jewish American men when it comes to the importance of Judaism in their lives, the performance of ritual practice, attending synagogue and adult education, and participation in Jewish cultural expressions. Ironically, women's greater commitment to Judaism and participation in the clergy is concomitant with yet another form of erosion, a new rise in secularization, that is, a period in which the authority of the non-Orthodox institutions and their rabbis is on the wane. And I would say that this is now happening as well in the Orthodox communities, which is why the lawyer says that religious society, that the rabbinate is liable, the foundations of the rabbinate are liable to erode, right, by not allowing women to participate. For those concerned about the future of Jewish religious institutions, it might be salutary to compare the stability of membership as well as institutional loyalty of congregations led by women versus those led by men. Additionally, questions regarding the clergy roles valued by male and female congregants respectively, and the degree and type of authority these congregants grant their rabbis, male and female, would be of interest for rabbinical seminaries and the future of the rabbinate. And so back to the opening of my lecture. Nowadays, women are studying Talmud, and even secular women are finding inspiration in the study of Jewish texts and the Talmud. What this means for new forms of identity, the survival of Judaism, and the Jewish tradition is yet to be discovered. I would like to end by quoting Bob Dylan's famous lyrics, "The times they are a-changing. Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing."
Judith, thank you very much for a very interesting and inspiring lecture. And thank you very much for preparing this. I think some new aspects for our lecture series. And I saw the first questions from students. And I look in my mailbox. The first question, I read it in German. Wie verhält sich die jüdische Erziehung der Kinder einer Familie, wenn es sich um eine gleichgeschlechtliche Ehe handelt oder die Mutter alleinerziehend ist? Oder kommt dies in jüdischen Gemeinden nicht vor? Fragezeichen. Das ist die erste Frage. Ich vermute mal, das Ende lässt sich schnell beantworten. Bitte.
So the question is about how children are raised when the marriage is when there's equality in the marriage, and what happens when it's children raised by mother only.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so in the modern Orthodox community, but nowadays also in the Reform and Conservative communities, if people want to have their children raised very specifically with a lot of Jewish education, they will send them to a Jewish day school. And at the Jewish day school, the children make very long hours and they have a double curriculum. So when I went to Jewish day school, right through high school, we started at 8 in the morning and we ended at 5 in the afternoon. And we had many classes in the Bible, in Talmud, in Mishnah, in Hebrew literature, as well as all the classes that one was obligated to have in the secular curriculum that everyone else in the country was following. But also in more Orthodox circles, there are separate classes for women to study Torah. Of course, there are many families where the children only attend Jewish education after school or on a Sunday or after the services on Shabbat morning. The question of single mothers is something different because there's no reason why a single mother wouldn't send her children to a Jewish school as well. I think sometimes it's a question of finances because, of course, Jewish schools are usually private schools, but there are scholarships for children whose parents don't have the finances, whether they're single parents or simply a married couple. I don't think there's really that. I don't think that plays a very important role. You could ask, what does the Jewish community think of women who are single or bring their children up?
Yes.
I think, divorce is allowed in Jewish communities. If we're talking about women who never got married and they want to have a baby because they just want to have a child and they think maybe I won't find a partner, or I don't want to have a partner, but I want to have a child. I know several of them, they're involved in the Jewish community and their children come to the Jewish school. There's no problem about that. I think the Orthodox community, wouldn't reject the children, although they might not particularly favor this kind of choice.
Danke. Ich lese aber mal die Fragen, die kommen auf Deutsch rein. Ich lese sie vor. Claudia kann eventuell auch übersetzen. Dieselbe Studentin hat noch eine zweite Frage. Und sie fragt nach einer modernen jüdischen Familie. Das ist natürlich die Frage, was ist eine moderne jüdische Familie? Ist es in einer modernen jüdischen Familie auch möglich, dass die Tochter beispielsweise das Tischgebet spricht? Und dann sagt die Studentin weiter, ich denke da vor allem an Pessach, oder wird das Gebet dann von einem männlichen Familienmitglied übernommen?
Okay, so actually, this is a very specific point about saying the prayer after the meal at the table, because in fact, in the halachic literature, the Jewish legal literature, it's actually not forbidden for women to lead the Birkat Hamazon, the prayer over the meal. However, it has not been tradition in most Jewish Orthodox families. I know modern Orthodox families where the women do lead it. This is because women are also obligated to say the prayer after the meal. And in many families, they do. Modern Orthodox, non-Orthodox, certainly women lead the prayers. They lead all prayers. They lead prayers and services. I also see reverse things, so that men light the Sabbath candles. And certainly men who live alone are obligated to light Sabbath candles. No one talks about that, but of course they're also obligated to light the candles. People always think that as something pertaining to women, but it's just an obligation. And it's become a woman's mitzvah, a commandment for women. So in the Middle Ages, women were said to have 3 commandments to which they were especially had to pay a lot of attention. One was when they baked the bread for the Sabbath, the braided bread, they had to take a piece off of it and let it burn in the oven as a remembrance of the temple and the destruction of the temple and the offers that were brought in the temple. They had to light the Sabbath candles, right? And they had to preserve the rules of purity. So the menstrual rules and the marriage rules about family purity. So these were the 3 commandments that were allocated specifically to women. So since then, lighting the Sabbath candles has been considered a women's thing. But of course, lighting the Sabbath candles is something that should be done. It's a commandment and men can do it also.
Okay, danke. Also das zeigt nochmal, man darf nicht so schematisch denken, nicht? Da sind Dinge in Bewegung und das ist wie in anderen also ich sag mal, wie im christlichen Bereich jedenfalls auch, also zumindest im katholischen, im evangelischen, dass es irgendwelche Normen gibt, aber da werden Dinge auch spontan verändert oder es entwickeln sich Dinge, genau. Ja.
So, but I would say that what's happened within the churches and what's happened in Judaism is very much parallel, of course, because these have to do with the changes that we've been, at least that I've experienced in my lifetime, the second feminist wave, and it's been of enormous influence on all religious institutions, either that they've changed and accepted it or that they've radically rejected it.
Jetzt kommt aber eine Frage, die sich zumindest im katholischen Bereich nicht so stellen würde. Eine Studentin fragt, wie wird damit umgegangen, wenn Rabbinerinnen schwanger werden?
Yeah.
Ist das ein Problem?
No, it's not a problem at all. In fact, there's a joke. There's a little bit of silly joke, but I'll tell it anyway. How can you tell the difference between the Orthodox, the conservative, or the Reform at the wedding? So at the wedding, the bride's mother is pregnant at the Orthodox wedding. At the conservative wedding, the bride is pregnant. And at the Reform wedding, the rabbi is pregnant. This is a little bit outdated joke, but it tells something about, because in the conservative movement, of course, we have rabbis now, and in the Orthodox movement as well, but it tells something about what was considered normal at least 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. So yes, it's completely normal. In fact, I'm sure most people know that, and this is actually a problem nowadays, that in Judaism, having family is very, very important. Being married and having children is very important. And especially since the Second World War, a lot of Jews feel it's necessary to replenish the Jewish community, which has been really dying out. Only the ultra-Orthodox are really having a lot of children. Most Jews do not even replicate themselves. Around the world, Jews have less than 2 children. The average Jewish couple has less than 2 children. So really, Jewish population is dying out. But of course, these values of getting married and having children are problematic nowadays when so many people remain single, or many people don't get married, or we have of course we have everything that's going on in the world is happening in the Jewish community as well. So we have gays, of course, and they have children as well, or they choose not to have children. So I mean, things are changing, and so we can have pregnant rabbis, we can have non-pregnant rabbis.
Ja, also liebe Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer, schicken Sie gerne weitere Fragen. Wir haben noch ein wenig Zeit und Sie merken, Judith Frischmann hat viele spannende Antworten. Ich komme nochmal zurück auf Regina Jonas. Ich habe in Berlin mal an der Stelle gestanden, wo, glaube ich, ihr Wohnhaus stand oder Geburtshaus, ich weiß es nicht, und fand das immer sehr beeindruckend. Und Regina Jonas taucht auch in dieser Vorlesungsreihe immer wieder auf. Mich würde nochmal interessieren, war Ihre Ordination damals, war das eine Sensation, war das eine Provokation? Und gibt es dann mehr Frauen, die in kurzer Zeit ordiniert werden, oder bleibt das singulär?
Okay, so I think Rabbi Klapek explained that Regina Jonas's ordination was private.
Yeah.
Right. So
okay.
She studied with one rabbi, and he ordained her. And if you question the ordination, his ordination, you question his authority. So I think people were hesitant to question his authority aloud. But of course, she did this because she was not allowed to enter the rabbinical seminary. So then it's a question of, do people recognize her or not? And I think she did a lot of social work. So she did a lot of good work, and she was acknowledged by a lot of people as a very sensitive person and a caring person who really accomplished quite a bit. But she never really was accepted as a congregational rabbi. Now, in the United States, there were several women who called themselves rabbi, and they were quite famous. In fact, there's one woman, Ray Frank, who went around preaching in circus tents, just like you have the evangelicals who went around preaching in tents. And she addressed Jewish women and told them they had to pay attention to what was happening at home instead of becoming so secular. They had to make sure that their children stayed Jewish. But at the same time, she said there's nothing wrong with women becoming rabbis or having important roles in the community and being right up front there in Jewish organizations. But she said, you also have to watch what's happening, what your children are doing. Don't let them get lost on the way while you're busy. So she was a little bit ambivalent. She combined all sorts of older ideas, which I showed the criticism of Jewish women for not, taking care to make sure they're giving them the responsibility of making sure their children were Jewish. On the other hand, she certainly acknowledged the possibility of women taking on new roles if they didn't ignore the other roles. But if you looked at what she did, I mean, there she was traveling all around the United States, speaking in these tents. I mean, you would say, what about her own example? So, and there were several women like that. So the breakthrough really came only in the 70s when the Reform movement in the United States ordained its first woman. So 5 years earlier, it admitted the first woman in 1967, which fits exactly with the feminist wave that was going on in the United States. And for the Reform movement, it was a little bit easier because the objections they had in the 19th century were not so much halachic, but they were, in fact, they used halachic arguments to prove it was possible to ordain women, but they said, they used social arguments. They said women shouldn't become rabbis because how could they possibly combine taking care of children and doing the things in the home and having a career, right? And this is things that men said about women in general and women going to work, entering the workforce in general. And it's unfortunately things that some men still say today. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Claudia, du hast eine Frage.
Yes, I was wondering, do Judaism is such a diverse phenomenon, and I was wondering what role models do girls have these days, Jewish girls, and maybe this is difficult to say. A 13-year-old girl from Mea Shearim in Jerusalem, what role models might she have as opposed to a Jewish girl from New York growing up in a somewhat secular Jewish family?
Okay, so let's take the girl first in Mea Shearim. Okay, there the past, no, at least 20 years or so, there's been this new phenomenon of the Rebbetzin, the wife of the rabbi, becoming a preacher. And we know that in Israel, you know, they have this stadium, and in this stadium, the Rebbetzins would come and speak, right? And they would attract thousands of women and girls, and they would give their own sermon, right? So they didn't call themselves rabbi, right? They didn't arrogate any special position to themselves, but there they were speaking and teaching women Torah, right? And talking to them about life. And I think, you know, this is really an important example to see that women have been learned, know what they're talking about, and set an example for other women. Now, as for the non-Orthodox community, also for the seculars, I mean, when I was studying in London, I also spent part-time studying at the Leo Baeck College, which is also a rabbinical college. And one of the students there was Rabbi Julia Neuberger. She was Julia Neuberger then. She became Rabbi Julia Neuberger. And Julia Neuberger became an advisor to the government on all sorts of issues, including fertility issues, and also things like euthanasia, so everything to do with life and death. And she became so well known that they even had a soap on the BBC with a woman rabbi in the main role. So by accident, I saw it one day and I thought to myself, wow, a soap with a woman rabbi as the main character. So I think, you know, this is becoming quite normal, and I think that also seculars see that. And I think a lot of people who call themselves secular are looking for some kind of form of spirituality. So they will join things online, right? My own sister does a Musar class online, which has to do with Jewish ethics, but also with some kind of form of meditation and mysticism. And she says, you know, after all my years of attending synagogue and being the daughter of a rabbi, she goes, this is actually, I found what I really like. And she says, it's not what we did at home. I wonder what Dad would think of it. And there are lots of, well, the story I opened with about the two women who are secular, and the one woman who likes to do gym and likes to read thrillers, detective stories, and yet she gets into this Talmudic thing and she does it every day. So people are looking for meaning in their lives, and some will turn to Buddhism or yoga or something else, and others will look to the Jewish tradition, or they might have a combination of both. Right. So I think there's plenty of examples, but we are having a very big movement away from organized religion. So the organized religious congregations and groups are really losing members, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that people are being less Jewish, but they're looking for alternative types of being Jewish. But I will add that what does get lost in the process is the question of the community, right? Because a lot of these chosen identities are very individualistic, and you choose what you want and you do what you want and you do it online and you do it yourself, but the feeling of community gets lost in the process, right?
Ich habe eine weitere Frage. Übersetze ich einmal ins Englische. especially in the books of Moses, is always spoken of the impurity of women by the monthly menstruation. This must also have led to that they were not allowed to go, to my knowledge, for example, also near the temple. How is dealt with the issue today? Und die Studentin schreibt, I hope that nowadays it no longer plays a role.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, I think the question of women going near to the temple has less to do with their ritual impurity and more to do with the fact of who's important and who's serving in the temple, right? Mm-hmm. So we have the Kohanim and the Leviim, the priests and the Levites, and then the common Israelites, and women are just, they're always lower than that. And then you get the children who are lower than that and the slaves who are lower than that. So there's a hierarchy. And I think the rabbis really are the ones who have expanded the rules of ritual purity. I mean, in the temple period, there's all sorts of impurity. There's every kind of impurity. If the men have an emission of semen, they're also impure. Leprosy is impure. Touching a corpse makes you impure. So there's a whole range of impurity. And a very interesting book about that would be Mary Douglas's book on danger and purity. I think the rabbinic period, men get quite obsessed about women's ritual purity, and that's very interesting because all the other forms of impurity are not relevant anymore now that there's no temple, right? So there becomes a focus on this, and Orthodox women, and maybe also other women, adhere to the rules of ritual purity, but it has nothing to do with them attending the synagogue or being active in the synagogue. And some people think a woman can't touch the Torah roll because she makes it impure, but that's not true because the Torah roll cannot become impure. So I think these are more questions between husband and wife than what happens in the outside. Right, in the community, going to synagogue. It really, there's no reason for a woman not to go to synagogue.
Thank you. Ich habe keine weiteren Fragen im Moment. Wenn noch jemand eine Frage stellen möchte, dann sollte er oder sie diese jetzt schicken. Ich warte noch mal einen kleinen Moment, da wir eine kleine Verzögerung haben mit dem Streaming. Aber da kommt nichts mehr. Ja, dann sage ich ganz herzlichen Dank. Das war wieder ein ganz toller Vortrag von Judith Frischmann, die schon seit vielen, vielen Jahren, ich weiß gar nicht, das liegt schon ganz viele Jahre zurück, dass du den ersten Vortrag in Erfurt gehalten hast, damals in der kleinen Synagoge. Und das ist schon eine ganz lange Tradition. Und Judith Frischmann ist auch ganz, ganz oft in Erfurt und wir hoffen, dass wir sie bald hier mal wieder begrüßen können.
Ja,
ja, das war sehr, sehr spannend und sehr, sehr anregend heute Abend. Also ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank. Jetzt kommt noch eine Frage. Die Frage gebe ich aber noch weiter. Die nehmen wir mal als letzte Frage. Did the idea of the Queen Sabbath have an impact on the duties of the housewife on the Sabbath? And if so, did this interpretation of the Sabbath play a role in the discussion of women's duties on the Sabbath today? Compare also the idea of interpreting the Shekhinah Feminine.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea of actually on the Sabbath Eve we sing a song that was written by one of the famous mystics of Safat, and we say, "Come, my beloved, to welcome the bride." And that is the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is takes on the metaphorically female form, and indeed can be related to the Shekhinah. Now, whether this affected Jewish women literally, I'm not really. I wouldn't be convinced about that. It's very interesting that the mystics could use all sorts of feminine forms without it changing the way they looked at things in reality. However, on Friday night, you know, the man is supposed to recite a special paragraph from the Proverbs for his wife, and this is the famous passage, Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. A woman of valor who can find her price is far above rubies, right? And then it tells all the duties that she does in the house, that she's in charge of the household, and she's in charge of all the production in the house. While her husband sits at the gate, that means that's usually in judgment. That's the place where the judge sits. So she has a lot of tasks to do, and she's praised for everything she does, but it doesn't say she's praised for studying the Torah. So I don't let my husband read that for me because it always irritates me. But I know other people who love hearing that, but I don't know. Maybe for some people, the idea of the mystical Sabbath as a queen brings something extra. I'm not convinced, though. I wouldn't dare to. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you very much again for this wonderful paper. Stay healthy and come back to Erfurt soon.
Yeah.
Bye bye to Amsterdam. Meine Damen und Herren, nächste Woche geht diese Vorlesungsreihe weiter. Dann haben wir ein ganz anderes Thema, aber ich denke ein sehr wichtiges Thema. Es geht im Grunde um die Wahrnehmung, um das Bild des Judentums in der evangelischen Kinderkatechese, im Religionsunterricht. Nur Abraham und Sarah, Fragezeichen, das Bild vom Judentum in der evangelischen Kirche mit Kindern. Und referieren wird Dirk Schliebhake aus Hildesheim. Und wir freuen uns, Sie nächste Woche hier wieder sehen. Können wir Sie ja leider nicht, aber begrüßen zu dürfen und mit Ihnen diskutieren zu dürfen. Vielen Dank und vielen Dank an Judith Frischmann, Claudia Bergmann. Einen schönen Abend Ihnen allen und bis zur nächsten Woche.